Hello everybody, Dark Skeleton here. With Standard Mode coming out very soon and my previous video, 20 strongest cards leaving Standard Mode, I figured, hey, why not give a little homage to the weakest cards from the Naxxramas set and the Goblins vs. Gnomes set, which are both leaving the game, at least for Standard Mode. First up, the Anubar Ambusher. At first glance, this card actually looks pretty solid. A 5/5 for 4 mana, that's not bad. And its Death Rattle effect, theoretically you'd be able to replay a Battle Cry effect. However, if you're playing this minion for that purpose of replaying a Battle Cry effect, it's too slow in almost every single matchup. And the thing about rogues is that they've almost always been tempo-based. If you lose the board too heavily, it's very hard to come back. And then, if you are trying to build a minion-based rogue deck, and you have this guy on the field, it prevents you from effectively playing anything else in your hand, because your opponent's going to see that and kill your Anubar off and basically get a free sap off. In many cases, his Death Rattle effect is more of a drawback than it is a boon, and that's not enough to justify a mere +1 attack over a Chillwind Yeti. Number 2, the Cobalt Guardian. Although Mech Paladin is a pretty cool idea and being able to chain together Divine Shields would theoretically be pretty effective, especially considering it's a 6 attack minion and you can really trade those Divine Shields off for huge value. The problem is that this card in itself is only a 3 health minion, and to play it with those other mechs is just too slow. The effect is unreliable and can be dealt with by simple damage such as a Mage's Fire Blast, so it's nowhere near in the same league as other 5 mana 6/3s like the Ethereal Conjurer. Number 3, Cobra Shot. This card is so terrible I had to make a video back when GVG was the newest set just to mock it. In very few circumstances would you actually want to spend 5 mana to deal 3 damage to your opponent's face and then 3 damage to a minion. Even in that ideal situation, like let's say, going back to Ethereal Conjurer, you take out an Ethereal Conjurer with it, why the 3 damage to the face? You either want to board control with your spell, or you want to deal damage to finish your opponent off, but very rarely both at the same time. The one benefit of Cobra Shot is that it doubles down on your spell damage, so it will deal 1 extra damage to the opponent's face and 1 extra damage to the minion, but that was never enough to make it see real play. Number 4, Dark Whispers. At face value, this card doesn't seem too terrible, but 6 mana for 5 Wisps is just not worth it in most cases. It's just asking to die to a random 1 damage AoE, such as a Pyromancer or a Swipe effect. So you could still pay 6 mana to get the 5/5 and Taunt effect, and that's not terrible, but it's not really well budgeted for the mana cost. You're paying a lot to have the ability to choose one, and you would pretty much always choose the +5/+5 and Taunt. So it's just not enough for how much mana you're paying for this card to have ever really seen any play. However, it's worth mentioning that it was at least a decent pickup in Arena mode. Oh, and the fact that they're trying to bring this card back in Old Gods with Wisps of the Old Gods, yes, terrible pun, is really sad, because 7 mana for 7 Wisps is still not good, nor is the +2 to all minions for 7 mana effect. These cards both kinda suck. Number 5, Flame Leviathan. This card is interesting, and a couple people definitely experimented with it in decks like Freeze or Fatigue Mage, but very rarely does it have such a dramatic effect on the game that it's worth putting this effectively a War Golem into your deck. It made some funny videos where you draw it at the craziest times, but aside from that, mostly a joke card. Number 6, Morgan Infantry. There was a time back in vanilla where apparently Blizzard thought that a 1/4 Taunt, the Ironbark Protector, was a good enough card to put in the game. Then they decided in GVG, you know what, a 1/4 Taunt for 3 mana isn't very good, we should give it Charge. It still sucks. Even in Hobgoblin decks, this card isn't particularly playable. There are always better options than paying 3 mana for 5 stats at 1/4 Taunt. Heck, there are cards in this video that are a 2 mana 1/4, that just goes to show you how sad it is. Number 7, the Goblin Sapper. This is one of the cards I actually wanted to be good in Fatigue or Mill decks by overloading your opponent's hand with a ton of cards. If their hand has 6 or more cards, this gains a +4 stat buff, which would make it a 6/3, which is 6/4 actually, which is actually pretty solid. The problem is that in most cases, unless you're going up against the easiest matchups ever, like a late game Control Priest, this card's effect is really hard to pull off. It's not a totally horrendous card, but it never really saw any competitive play. Number 8, Hemet Nesting. This card is hilarious. I don't know what Blizzard was thinking, like beasts are this huge threat that needs to be dealt with. Battlecry, destroy a beast, and otherwise it's a 5 mana 6/3. If you're gonna have a 5 mana card, it needs to do something big when it comes out onto the field. And yeah, if there were, say, a lot of really big beasts that needed to be dealt with a lot of the time, saying that like a late game control hunter or a late game beast druid was actually a thing, then maybe this card wouldn't have been horrendous. It still would have been really bad because that's only 2 classes that play beasts, but this card just pretty much sucks because there's very few beast targets that are even worth targeting with a card like this, and they only exist in 1, maybe 2 decks. Basically, you'd be talking about a mid-range Hunter Savannah Hidemane, and that deck was just not popular enough to justify actually putting this card in the deck. It's the same reason Kazan Mystic isn't that great. Except Kazan Mystic had 3 whole classes to target with this, and with Secret Paladin and all mages being incredibly popular, as well as Hunter decks, Kazan Mystic was actually arguably playable. Number 9, Junkbot. This card actually looks like it could be a playable card, being a 5 mana 1/5 that gets +2/+2 every time one of your mechs die. It's similar to playing a Cult Master, but more for building a stronger board. And I think at the start of GVG there was actually a little bit of experimentation with this card. The problem is that for it to be good, 2 mechs on your side of the field have to die while this card is out, and that just makes it incredibly situational for when it can be good. And in all other circumstances, it's going to be pretty bad as either a 5 mana 1/5 or a 5 mana 3/7. And also note that pretty much all mech decks were tempo based, so putting 5 cost minions into your deck like this is just asking to be playing a little bit too slow. Number 10, Myaxna. I wanted this card to be pretty good as some kind of late game super control card where you take out 2 of your opponent's legendaries, but in most cases this card can be dealt with pretty easily. For instance, if you're playing a Zoo-style deck, you can pretty much ignore it for the first turn or 2 it's out, and then if it has, say, 4 or 5 HP left, you can power overwhelming it and finish it off at your own leisure because it's not really that threatening. If you're playing a Priest deck, you can actually steal it with a Cabal Shadow Priest or a Shadow Ward Pain. And the easiest general way to just make it ineffective is not to play minions that it's going to get a huge amount of value on. So sure, it's not a terrible card, but it is really slow, it doesn't do anything the second it hits the board, and generally speaking, it's just a 6-drop minion that has maybe a little bit of a bonus effect. But at that said, most 6-drops can already take out most other minions in one hit anyway. Number 11, the Anubar Weblord. This is a card I thought would actually be pretty good by denying your opponent the ability to play Battlecry minions, and yes, in some circumstances you may get that effect off. However, 1/4 stats really isn't that great. Armorsmith can get away with it because its effect is insane in Warrior if you play some Whirlwind effects or that kind of thing. But very rarely are you going to deny your opponent an entire turn simply by making their Battlecry minions cost 2 more. Battlecries, while common, aren't played enough in the game that a whole hand is going to be completely full of them in most cases. The card is just overall too situational to really be good. If you were going up against a Battlecry Shaman, yeah, sure, it would be really good, but that kind of thing is not really competitive, and even if it was, it would still be pretty uncommon. Number 12, Poison Seeds. This is a pretty laughable attempt by Blizzard to release a AoE card for druids that is actually playable. The problem with turning all of your opponent's minions into 2/2 treants is that this is very rarely an effect that's strong enough to justify the mana cost. You play a 4 mana spell and you get very little effect out of it compared to a nice AoE spell like Swipe. And yes, you could argue that by playing Poison Seeds, you could cheat out some of those minions that cost 1 less for every minion that died this turn, because technically when they turn into the treants, they did get destroyed, they did die, but that's not really enough to make this style of deck a thing. It was cute more than anything else. Number 13, Recycle. You can take any of your opponent's minions and remove it off the board, send it back into their deck. And that's not terrible, but for the mana cost you're paying, it's not particularly great. In a late game control matchup, which you're probably playing if this is a card that's in your deck, considering it costs 6 mana, they're still gonna get to replay it. So it's not so great to like send their Ragnaros back into their deck just so they can draw it and play it again. It's nowhere near as good as Entomb, and this is a comparison that's been made a million times. Why would you pay 6 mana to send a good card, back into your opponent's deck when you could pay 6 mana as a priest to send that minion back into your own deck? Now, yeah, so you could argue druids need weaker cards considering they can ramp up for them to stay balanced and they're already a really strong class, but yeah, this card was not really good enough to see much play at all. Number 14, Shadow Bomber. At first glance, this card actually looked like it would be okay, sort of like putting another Leper Gnome in your deck if you were going to play a hyper-aggressive priest. However, it also deals damage to you, and if your opponent can ever put you on the back foot, it's not particularly great. So, dealing 3 damage to both players, nowhere near as good as dealing 2 damage solely to your opponent as a death rattle effect. Not only that, but Priest as a class is naturally defensive with its hero power, so aggro Priest never really was a thing, and it may never even really be a thing. So because Priest is inherently a defensive class and it's just a bad Leper Gnome, it's a card that never really got to see any real play. Number 15, the Stoneskin Gargoyle. This is the card I wanted to be playable because it has such a cool effect to regain all its HP at the start of your turn. However, going back to the Iron Bark Protector or whatever it's called, the 1/4 taunt, 1/4 stats is not enough for a 3-drop minion unless its effect is absolutely insane. In most cases, this is just a 1/4 that's going to die immediately because your opponent's going to ram some 4 damage minion into it, and that's going to be really sad. If you invest a buff into it, then your opponent's probably just going to take it out with something like Fireball, recognizing it as a threat once you've sunk 2 cards into it. But in order for Stoneskin Gargoyle to be worth anything, you need to put buffs in it so that it can actually have a massive amount of HP and regain that at the start of your turn. Any competent player, though, is just going to remove it, and when they remove it, it's 2 or 3 cards, your card and your buffs, for 1. Number 16, the Target Dummy. The only real case I can see this card really being a thing, it was with the Iron Sensei card. Basically 2/2/3 mana, give your mech +2/+2 at the end of your turn. Of course that target is chosen randomly, but I guess at 0 mana, 2/4 isn't too bad when you play it with a 2/2. That said, that's not really enough to justify this card. In most cases, you just play an Annoyatron over it, a 1/2 Divine Shield taunt with 2 mana cost. If you were playing Mech Rogue and you really needed a 0 mana 2/4 taunt, then you probably already lost the game anyway, because that was a very hyper-aggressive and not a competitive one at that. Besides, even if sometimes you can play it as a 2/4, in most cases it's just a 0/2, which is, woo, I tanked 2 damage, I'm a Shaman's hero power. Number 17, Tree of Life. This card's effect is actually pretty insane, being able to restore both characters, actually all characters on the field, including big-ass Ancient of War taunts, to full HP. The problem is, if you're actually in the situation where you can heal both your minions and your face this much HP, you probably already won the game anyway, and in all other circumstances, paying 9 mana to do that is just way too much. Remember, you're also healing your opponent, so it's just kind of ridiculously bad. If this was like a 4 or 5 mana spell, then sure, maybe, but the problem is, why not just play Reno Jackson? Healing minions isn't exactly the most common play that's actually good, because oftentimes your opponent will just outright remove a minion after you've used it to trade once. It's just too slow of a card, and if you happen to play it in the circumstance where your opponent actually has board control, you don't have any minions, then you're just asking to get knocked down to 15 HP or something like that again. You can't play a 9 mana card in the late game against any deck that has tempo whatsoever and expect to get away with it. You'll just lose all your life again. Against a control deck, it's completely unnecessary. Number 18, Undertaker. This card actually used to be good when it got +1 attack and +1 health when you play a Death Rattle minion. Thank goodness that Blizzard actually nerfed it though. I think everybody was getting really sick of Undertaker decks basically dominating the competitive scene. Ever since it got nerfed down though, it went from being a god tier card to completely unplayable. If you're going to play a 1 mana 1/2 that requires other cards to buff its attack up, then you might as well play a Lowly Squire, and no one plays Lowly Squire. Number 19, a Vitality Totem. When you get this card off of a Tuskar Totemic, it's actually pretty decent, but that's because it's a free totem that doesn't involve playing a card. Otherwise, this is just a 0-3, and there are very few circumstances in the current metagame where you'd ever want to play a 0-3 minion. Flametongue Totem isn't even played all the time anymore. You can't afford to play a 2-mana 0-3 because in most cases your opponent's just going to play minions, run them into this thing, and any health that you got back is going to be lost as your opponent gains a massive advantage in board control. In other words, in almost any situation that you're not going up against a freeze mage, which is spell damage based, you want tempo instead of just pure healing effects. Losing tempo is going to cost you a lot more life than not having a healing effect in your deck is. Number 20, and the final card for this video, we Spellstopper. This guy actually has a pretty cool effect. Adjacent minions can't be targeted by spells or hero power, but as a 4-mana 2/5, the stats on this guy are just way too weak. I think I saw a couple people experimenting with it, and I wanted it to be good because it's like, oh, you can protect your Ragnaros or your Ysera or something like that, but if you're playing that greedily where you're trying to make an invincible Ragnaros, in most cases, it's just playing way too slow. You're gonna have to play this guy as just a 2/5, and if you ever have to do that, it's just a very weak card. And then in the few matchups like Control versus Control where you could play a card like this, which is incredibly greedy, it probably makes more sense to just put another big guy in your deck to begin with. So, that's it for this video. I've been Dark Skeleton. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments, feel free to let me know down below. What kind of video would you like to see next? And if you want to support this channel so that I can keep growing, then it would help a lot if you could go to my Patreon page and throw a couple shekels my way so that I can make this more of a real thing rather than just a hobby. But until my next video, I've been Dark Skeleton once again. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.